Welcome, Jensen, therapist, superhero. Thank you for coming today for the premiere of season 3, episode 1 of What the Fuck is Life. We have so much to touch on. I've been MIA for 18 months at this point, finding myself in the woods of Tasmania. And now I'm back, and you're back. And you came back with new essay, new writing, new thoughts, new thinking, which I very much appreciate. We have a lot to cover today in our short hour. But first of all, thank you. And so happy to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Max. I'm so glad you found yourself. And
Yeah, well, I'm still looking. The Tasmania, there's a lot more going on in that country than I realized. But we're here and we're safe and we're alive. And I'm back in the womb of northern New Jersey, where I feel safest and most like myself. So today we're going to be talking about, we're delayed because of my own trepidation, anxiety, and technical difficulties over the last few years here. But we wanted to talk about many moons ago, transference in the afternoon. And we wanted to talk about love and the transference. We want to talk about the lovesick analyst. We wanted to talk about Davies and Gabbard and your paper, and obviously countertransferential disclosure. It's a hot topic, no pun intended, but maybe not talked about a lot outside of very specific analytic circles, which is maybe our MO today, that wouldn't it be kind of neat if there was a way to discuss the ethics of it at large in the psychotherapeutic world, even if that includes other modalities or even other people who are in the helping profession, of how do you negotiate relational dynamics with those you wish to help. But, particularly in psychotherapy, it's quite difficult. So with that said, what's your paper all about?
Well, it is about erotic countertransference disclosures. And it's the reason I wrote it. It's specifically a criticism that I feel like was missing. The grad school I went to was fairly relational. It was all psychoanalytic, and very relational. And so that's kind of where I come from. And I've read a lot of the relational literature more than stuff in other psychoanalytic camps. And I found myself a little irritated by some of the articles in relational psychoanalytic literature seem to sort of assume it's like a given that a therapist sometimes may disclose erotic or romantic or sexual feelings to the patient. And I just felt like I was taken aback when I looked inside it. There wasn't really a lot of criticism of those takes. And I think some of that is because Jody Davies had the sort of like original argument for it. And it's a great paper. And everyone, I think, in that camp loves Jody Davies. I do, her writing and what she's done for our field. And so I think because it's a great paper and she's a really well-known and well-respected analyst, I feel like that might be part of why there hasn't been a lot of criticism of some of the subsequent articles on the topic.
There's definitely a convenience, right? So in my education, training, treatment, et cetera, there is an expedience or convenience to using a paper, often the case, as any sword and shield against more idiopathic or idiosyncratic truths about ourselves as practitioners and also as patients. And so particularly maybe the one that's most difficult to speak to is hate in the countertransference as Winnicott, but also of course love. And love seems to be stickier, no pun intended. That was gross, Max. Because it seems like it's more threatening, right? Even though there's so many of us as therapists tend to be, as we often speak to, depressive and masochistic and self-depriving and yada, yada, yada. So we steer away from hate, the shadow, to be Jungian. We steer away from integration of our own needs. We self-deprive. But then we maybe even more taboo, to be Freudian, is that, can you love a patient, right? And how is that utilized constructively, I think, is the big discussion that's still debated to this day. It seems to have ebbed and flowed through the culture in my understanding and reading. I'm fairly certain, and correct me where I'm wrong, that Davies-Gabbard debate series of papers was something like 25 years ago, something like that.
It was, yeah.
Which is pretty cool. They did that. I didn't even know until we planned for this episode. I didn't even know that happened.
Yeah. Maybe I should give a little history for.
Please. Yeah.
Okay. So I actually don't know the year that Jody Davies published Love in the Afternoon. Love in the Afternoon is this paper we're talking about where she discloses.
I feel like it was the 90s, but I don't know.
I think it was like the early 90s.
Yeah.
She publishes this paper. It's a big deal because in it, she talks about, from the relational tradition, there's like maybe a place and a time within the idea of like, it's a two-person psychology now. There's mutuality,
Right.
there's a real relationship that she disclosed to her patient that she has had sexual feelings and thoughts about him. And she talks about why she did that. And so that was published in the early 90s. And then, yeah, a few years later, her and Glenn Gabbard, who's a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, had a little back and forth exchange in psychoanalytic dialogues about that
Right.
paper. And she sort of defended her position while Glenn Gabbard criticized it. And it was a very respectful exchange. Like I think they both made really good points, but I think Glenn had a lot of good critical feedback for her. And then, yeah, I guess to your point, I feel like after that, there's been a few articles that I know of, and maybe more by male analysts disclosing, kind of arguing for why they disclosed erotic countertransference to their patients. And I feel like those papers, the arguments have some holes in them.
I'm not gonna take that one because it's the first episode back, so
Yeah, this can't be it.
I gotta tread lightly,
I
Tasmania, as I
walked
said, there
right
was a
into
lot of
that.
finding myself, but there are a lot of holes. So it's my understanding, leaving that joke on the table, that not only was it respectful, the Gabbard and Davies debate, but they almost ended up from the summary, like, arguments that I read through Google, is
Mhm.
that they ended up more or less on the same page. Not to do a disservice to the nuance, but like they both sort of just agreed, to be a little bit reductive, that there's a time and a place. But Gabbard's whole point, which I find Gabbard to be, one of the greatest, was that if you're Davies, you can do it.
Right,
But
that's right.
I'm almost certain he said something to the effect of,
Yes.
for the 99.9% of the rest of us, don't fucking do it, because we're not Davies, and maybe you're not equipped with that clinical instrument to feel through that, titration curve of how do you negotiate that micrometer illustration of, reveal of the countertransferential whatever force without rupture, without enactment, without narcissistic gain, and I thought that was, relatively speaking, profound, even though sort of obvious, but profound because it comes back to the clinical humility and the capacity to feel the idiopathy with the patient, or with yourself. And that's very, very hard. So I like how he said, again, Google showed me this, but he's like, don't do it unless you're unless you're Glenn Gabbard or Davies or Nancy McWilliams or, Karen Murata or somebody.
Well, yeah. Yes, and there are 2 points that I think he made that are really important. One is, and he knows this from his own research because he spent a lot of his career, providing therapy to therapists who have committed sexual boundary violations. So not just disclosing countertransference, but
Sure.
actually acting on it or entering a sexual relationship with their patients. And he talks a lot about in his own writings, and he mentions this in the exchange with Davies, that, yeah, there's a lot of need for reflection, specifically on the therapist's narcissism, and narcissism gets in the way of reflection, and reflection is so needed because we're never fully aware of our motivations when we disclose anything. And I think that's a really important point, and it hasn't been talked about enough since the Davies article, because the research that both him and Andrea Salenza have done shows that a lot of times the therapist who discloses erotic countertransference isn't getting supervision and is also, like, on personality measures, more narcissistic than the average therapist. So there is something there, I think, that he was probably pointing to, that Davies, obviously don't know Davies personally, but I think from Davies' writings, you can see that she does have a pretty high capacity to reflect on her own motivations. And I think, probably has a high degree of humility that even comes out in that paper. And so, for the average therapist to kind of take her example and assume, yeah, that they maybe can do the same thing, when really perhaps they still need to be more aware of their own narcissistic injuries and needs. I think that's something that continues to be a huge risk. And the other point he makes is about gender. I think there's a quote in those exchanges where he says, when a man discloses sexual feelings to a woman in this society, still today, I mean, this was in the 90s, but I think it's probably still true today, that has a different connotation than when a woman expresses desire for a man. and that is also a huge component of the paper and her disclosure. And I think he already saw in the 90s that analysts were taking that paper and just running with it. And yeah, to your point, he was like, not everyone is Jody Davies. Not everyone's a woman. Not everyone is experienced, and not everyone is as aware of themselves, even in the analytic world.
Right. That part's, particularly apparent. That X factor, as it's often called. I think of Adam Phillips's writing, right? That how the depth and breadth of the clinical instrument in the individual, that irrespective of treatment and training, how large or how multidimensional is somebody's reflective functioning,
Right.
their mentalization, how much can they carry interpsychically, interpersonally, and relationally in the room. I often, when I use this metaphor of spinning plates or like expanding and contracting balloons, and then the more you get to know the supervisee or the patient or whatever yourself in treatment, you can feel more. Hopefully, you can feel more of the expanding and contracting nature of those balloons and the sort of, again, the phenomenological quality, what it feels like to have all these plates or balloons informing or influencing or determining thoughts, feelings, behaviors, even if they're unfelt or unformulated or unthought, so to speak. And if you're not, let's say there's a genetic immutable limitation, it could be epigenetic, I guess, as well, and you have 20 balloons, to be a bit silly, but you can only really feel 17 of them, and then you're not conscious that there's these other three that have a causal power, a deterministic, value, and you're behaving in such a way under the guise that you know yourself fully. That's a hugely, right, borderline humiliating, humbling, humiliating lesson, I think, for all of us. I preach often in this chair that you have to go through. And I don't know how you get, as you and I have discussed in the past, does everybody go through that? Is that possible? And then, so do we err on the side of being safer, which is to say, of course, not only not acting or joining in an enactment of a sexual violation or boundary violation, but also then not necessarily revealing a kind of transferential, I'm not sure, piece of information. Some of it has to be brought into the room. Understanding in my work with my own patients, but certainly the challenge is, how do you do that? And thoughtfully, carefully, tactfully in your own style. And how do you do that in such a way that it's not polluting or diluting the frame, but rather is conducive to what? Working through, feeling through. And when it comes to, I guess, eroticized versus other forms of love in the work or hate, it seems very, very dangerous. I'm not, I don't have an answer as to how you sort of generalize that or negotiate that.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the literature and part of what the paper I'm writing hinges on is that how to do that. I think with a lot of affects and things
Mm,
in the room and the transference and countertransference, but I think it's especially important with eroticized transferences and countertransference is to maintain the transitional or as if relationship, meaning
right.
like that sort of like in between reality and fantasy, which is, as Winnicott explains, is a place of play, right? So it's in that way, the therapist doesn't want to shut down the eroticized transference because that's very important to understand what's going on there in order to be of service to the patient. So we don't want to, if we feel so uncomfortable with our own sexuality that we sort of shut that down explicitly or
Mm,
implicitly and the patient feels it, that's not helpful. But we also don't want to, if we just insert our own feelings by explicitly stating them, that can also collapse the transitional
right.
space because that can be overstimulating, frightening. It can, now we're in a place where the therapist's feelings can kind of overwhelm the room and shut down like the freedom that the patient feels.
Right. That balancing act. You remind me that the episode I did with our colleague Jace on the field, as it's called in the interrelational world,
Yeah.
and the choreography or the dance. I thought that was very helpful. it still sticks with me that you have to have this tolerance for spontaneity, for play, for improvisation, and leaving it there in that liminal space or the as if space in this threshold between reality and fantasy. And if you can't tolerate that because it's anxiety provoking or uncomfortable, right, it necessarily does collapse. I think that that's fairly universal, or if not universally agreed upon. I don't know. Maybe it ought to be, but certainly the two sides of a kind of false binary that seem most prolific nonetheless are the censorship of the therapist who kind of plays by the rules proverbially and censors the part of themselves that is base, right? Their own humanity or base needs that are incompatible with the virtue of being a therapist, which I've certainly experienced in whatever with colleagues or friends or patients or teaching, whatever. And then the other side, as your paper speaks to more, this latest paper that transferred to the afternoon one, I think that's what it was called. And it's like you acted it out. You had sex with a patient, and then you, after the fact, are saying it's justified either through a legal medium, which has nothing to do with what we're speaking to, or it was mutually agreed upon or something. And all these other rationales, it seems, that in my understanding, betray, the frame, even
Mhm.
which is like without the rapport, the frame, the relationship, the sort of consensual agreement as to what we're doing in the work of developmental psychotherapy, healing based psychotherapy, there's nothing to be done. Again, it seems so untenable to me. And yet here you are with all this evidence and writing another paper on it because it's still happening, which is somewhat to me is crazy to say, like kind of mind blowing. I don't know if that's unempathic of me. There's a part of me that's saying, is that, am I being an asshole? Another part of me is saying, maybe I've never experienced that strong of a countertransferential response. And then another part of me is saying, well, I just wouldn't do such a thing. I don't know. I could see how difficult this becomes in the field to the point where I know anecdotally, just last spicy thought, I know anecdotally of someone, this is a tangential relationship, but who married their psychologist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this happens. This will
Yeah.
keep happening. Sexual boundary violations will keep happening, and sexual countertransference disclosures will keep happening. Yeah, I think that I've been challenged in the last year reading all the literature I can that's available on this topic for my paper. I've been challenged with that to really wrap my head around how do sexual boundary violations occur, because it does. I think when you read some of the stories, it feels shocking. And as therapists, yeah, it's easy to sort of be like, never
Right.
me.
Right.
But I guess to go back to, I through thread in all of this really is narcissism. I mean that in the little n, like the narcissism within all of us, the narcissistic vulnerabilities we all have. Again, to go back to Salenza and Gabbard's research, they talk, I think Salenza uses the word narcissistically needy as far as the therapists who tend to commit violations, and Gabbard calls them lovesick. But they're
Lovesick.
talking about,
Right.
yeah, they're talking about the same kind of person. I like narcissistically needy because I think it really speaks more to the underlying vulnerability in some of these therapists. And it also speaks to a commonality that we all need to be aware of, which is being a therapist, especially in private practice, is quite isolating. And the research shows it's usually middle-aged male therapists who aren't happy in their marriages or who are single that are most at risk. And
Well, we
another,
gotta we gotta
yeah.
we gotta slow down. We gotta.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put an edit. I'm gonna put alarm. So the research, meaning substantive, quantitative
Yes.
research,
Yes.
shows, because I think I'm somehow approaching an age that is not, maybe you could argue in the middle.
Right.
So I don't think so
Appro-
yet.
Not there yet.
I'm 29, just on repeat ad infinitum. But so middle aged, which is what? 40 to 60? Is that middle age? What is, well,
I
60 is not
think,
middle
right?
aged, but
Yeah.
even though we say it is, but people don't really live to 120, so I don't really get it. But let's say, and they're not happy in a marriage. These are heterosexual, I'm presuming, or is this a
Yes.
homosexual
That
analyst?
mhm, mhm,
Heterosexual analysts, men, middle
mhm,
aged, that are it's a statistical significant markup,
mhm.
whatever
Yes.
the word would be in probability and statistics, that
Mhm.
that's the most vulnerable population to commit these, to join in these enactments, or breach of a boundary, or have a sexual violation, or whatever it would be called.
Correct. Yes. They're the most likely to actually commit a boundary violation.
Mhm.
And then, the arguments that Salenza and Gabbard would make would be every sexual boundary violation, almost every, was likely preceded by a sexual countertransference disclosure. I think I
That
don't
makes
so
sense.
yeah, so Gabbard is really kind of this slippery slope argument here, which I find interesting. I mean, I'm really sympathetic to it. I think there is probably a slippery slope. So and Salenza, I think, takes more, she sees it as more distinct, and there's a place for these disclosures perhaps sometimes. But yeah, it the therapist's personal narcissistic, like their needs, are their needs getting met in their personal life? When narcissistic needs, meaning like their self-esteem, are they feeling desired and appreciated in their personal relationships? The therapist who isn't is more at risk. And I found that compelling. And to your point, they're like, yeah, it's important, I think, for therapists, not just analytic therapists, to know about this research, because that's not like some sociopathic therapists, right? That I
Right.
think we want to see like therapists who do this as like somehow apart from us. But the research kind of shows they usually feel these are therapists who care about their job, who usually feel great remorse after the
Oh, I didn't
violation.
realize that. Interesting. Because they're
Yeah,
not sociopathic. They're not
right.
psychopathic. They're fully capable of feeling a reparative guilt, to be
Yes.
carveth, or remorse, or contrition, or shame.
Yes. Yes. And so the other thing about this that I found really interesting is when it starts with a disclosure, oftentimes what's happening is the therapist can't contain or handle being on the receiving end of negative transference. So, like a patient may come in and yet sometimes be seductive or talk about their erotic transference, but then other times talk about how they're getting worse, or the
Mm.
therapist is so cold, and why won't the therapist be warmer, and why won't the like that's what would heal me if you would just actually be real with me. And it's like the therapists who can't sort of contain themselves and tolerate the anxiety of being on the receiving end of that, being told like you're not helping enough, if you would just love me back. That's sometimes where a therapist will commit a boundary violation. It is also sometimes where I see in some articles where therapists disclose their sexual feelings. I think as a way, they don't, what's missing is, I think, the reflection in some of these papers that they justify it as like, that my patient needed to hear this so that now we can both talk about our sexuality, and they knew what I was feeling anyway, so isn't it better to just put it out there? And I think sometimes what's missing there is like, okay, but what were you as a therapist feeling that you couldn't contain? Were you feeling having to carry an anxiety about this
Mm.
patient being mad at you, not just like wanting you or desiring you, but also maybe were you feeling inadequate? And that's, to go back to Gabbard and Salenza, that's often where therapists, after a boundary violation, when they're reflecting on it, they'll say, well, they were going to commit suicide if I didn't have sex with them, or something along those, maybe not that extreme, but something along those lines. So part of it seems, I think, to be like a move of desperation that isn't, I think, is more of like it's the therapist often not being able to sort of like metabolize sort of what they're on the receiving end of.
It's interesting well, it's obviously all interesting, that must be some very good sex to save somebody's life. On top of that, thank you for laughing. On top of that, I was sitting on that one for like 15 seconds. Do I say it? Do I not say it? Um, uh, the hate people, I feel like something too that's so counterintuitive is that hate and love are two sides of the same coin,
That's
right?
right.
There's huge
Yes.
conflation in the psychologically illiterate world of our culture where it's like, they're separate enterprises, or that, depression is opposite of happiness. I hear that quite often, or hate is the opposite of love. And it's just apathy, right? As we understand psychodynamically, is the real opposing force, the divestment or decathexis of an energic force like libido. Hate has nothing to do in that sense with love. They're quite parallel, and they're interwoven in a sense, especially with many, many elements of human behavior as a motivating force. And so I can sympathize a lot with the therapist who feels a sense of inadequacy given the to continue these metaphors in the literature, the castration from the patient says, "You're the worst therapist ever. You're a piece of shit. You're not helping me. Can't you just be real with me?" Or the pull of, the gratification of the pathology colluding with the defense is so classic. You learn so you're sort of inculcated. You're trained so hard in analytic training early on to not do that, to not
Mhm.
give in a sense. And then if you have these unresolved narcissistic vulnerabilities, I don't think it's a coincidence, like you're saying, that it's mid-career or middle age, whatever you would call it, because you're out of formal training also. Are you
Right.
still in group supervision? Are you still in a book club? Are you still participating in some form of treatment? Are you on your second stint of analysis or not? And if you're not, under the veil of the, again, lowercase n, like you said, narcissism, you do become more vulnerable because those are human features. That's another whole nother aside for another episode, but people don't fucking get what narcissism is. They think it's the big N, it's the psychopathic, sociopathic, antisocial. But we're all narcissistic in very profound ways, even if they're incompatible with our sort of agreed upon between subject object of ourselves, image or identity. But we all have those needs, and so anyway, so you could be catalyzed by hate from the patient, and that makes you uncomfortable. But you could also be catalyzed by love, and that makes you uncomfortable. But both can necessitate, if you can't, as you use the word, or Winnicott, you can't contain, you can't sustain the halting environment. The environment or the field itself can't allow for the play or the pretense ish, not the best word, the practice, maybe the praxis of, right, what this would feel like if I were your lover, if I were your mother, father, sister, brother, lover, enemy, whatever, as we're sort of supposed to use it. And you say, ah, fuck it, you know, my marriage sucks, or I've been single for 20 years, or my kids hate me, or I'm tired of paying bills. It's only human. It makes me sympathetic. But then I read, I don't know if this is, again, adjacent or tangential, but then you read that most recent one, which we were supposed to do when it was in the zeitgeist it was a female analyst, Transference in the Afternoon, I think, again, it was called. And then it's like the 6,000 page email dossier. I think that was the actual number. Something like 5 or
Well,
6,000
yeah,
emails, yeah,
'cause
and it was
right,
like a
'cause it's
decade of
over a
relationship,
decade.
and he was paying her, like, something like $250 an hour to get his brains fucked out. That's in the literature. Brains fucked out is a clinical term. And then she says, as soon, what was her excuse? That he wants money. How did she say it? Do you remember? It was once the money
Yeah.
was exchanged, or once we admitted to each other. It was the reveal, like you said. I'm sorry. It was the once you say it out loud. Now the relationship is ended as patient and doctor, and now we are lovers or whatever, and that makes it okay because there was a lawsuit, right? Wasn't there a lawsuit involved?
There is a
Oh, there
lawsuit.
is a lawsuit. Okay.
It is not even settled yet. And yeah,
Okay.
okay, so to give the viewer background, yes, Transference in
Yeah.
the Afternoon, which is a play on the Davies article name, was an
Which is
a
love in the
which
afternoon.
is Love in the
Right.
Afternoon. A journalist wrote a piece about a case in New York, and I won't say the names because it's still going on. And
No, I'm not.
yeah,
I'm not trying to get sued. I don't know.
well, and I feel myself as you're talking about this sympathetic to everyone involved,
Yes.
which is interesting because I haven't sometimes when I was reading this, I felt mostly anger. But yeah, in this case, it was a woman, middle-aged woman therapist
Don't even know what that means anymore.
who was
She's
lonely,
97 years old.
Yeah, she was in her 40s and she was lonely in her marriage and having, had, I think, young kids at the time. So, like, the stressful time of life, right? Lonely in her marriage. And a male patient told her that he was developing feelings for her. And now I've read the transcripts of the
You've
lawsuit.
read 6,000 emails.
Not all 6,000, but I have read
Ladies and
through
gentlemen,
some.
Catherine has a lot of time on her hands.
Yeah,
Okay.
and in it, she mentions that before the violation, she was feeling inadequate as a therapist. Like, she didn't feel like she was helping him enough.
Wow.
He was part of he had PTSD. He had been a part of a mass shooting. And when he came back from that traumatic event, she felt kind of at a loss as far as how to help him. And then he starts to disclose to her that he's very attracted to her. And then the violation happens, which she is saying wasn't a violation because she ended the treatment
Right. That's
relationship, and then immediately they start sleeping together. So, and then his argument is that this lasted for a decade, and then he decided to go to school to become a therapist. And when he
wow.
sat down in the therapist chair during his internship, it's like suddenly he was like, "Oh my God,
What the fuck?
what the fuck? Like,
Yeah.
this
What
wasn't
just
like
happened? Yeah.
an affair." Yeah. And then so now he is suing her, and he is also suing her supervisor, which is very interesting, who is a well-known analyst in the.
Wow. I'm so glad you remember. I didn't remember all this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, what a cautionary tale, I
Yeah.
think, in so many ways. She was getting supervision, which isn't most of the time. Gabbard has shown the therapists who commit violations aren't getting supervision. So, to your point, they're mid career and they at some point stopped sort of getting ongoing support, whether in their own therapy or supervision. But in this case, she was getting supervision from an analyst who specifically is known for helping therapists with erotic transference.
You're
So
messing
that,
with me.
yeah, no.
To help, but no. Okay, wait. Helping in the sense of I'm not trying to be funny. Helping in the constructive sense of helping them work through it, or
Mhm.
helping them in the enactment sense of like let's use Davies's paper as a way to maybe you don't know, but
Well, I do know. So at
okay.
least I know. So I'll
I
get
don't want
a,
to put you on the spot. Yeah.
no. I'll get a little judgmental here
All right.
about the
Wait.
person who I.
Let me just put on the judgmental alarm system. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is part of my.
Entered the judgment zone.
Enter the judgment, though. This is part of my beef. So if we go beyond like erotic countertransference disclosures, which I think,
Mhm.
yeah, most of the time, bad idea. That with some exceptions,
When you're the Michael Jordan of analysts,
when you're the Michael Jordan of analysts,
you can do it.
this also, for people watching, besides Love in the Afternoon, the other article I would recommend as far as like a disclosure that was probably necessary is Jonathan Slavin's Moments of.
I don't know if he was a Slaven or a Slavic.
You know what? Slavin, Slavin, I don't know.
Because he's one of my folk, he's one of my Ashkenazi
Y
folk.
Oh, yeah.
It's Slavin is Slavin. I don't know, but for all I know,
Well, I'm gonna go with you.
don't no
You.
no 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 no. We have to ask mutual. We have to ask our mutual friends.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I'll say right now, Jonathan Slavin, his
yeah.
article "Moments of Truth in Psychoanalysis," I think also is a
Mm.
good example of maybe one that was very thought through and ethical and actually ended up helping because the patient could tell the therapist in a moment was attracted to her and she was terrified.
Wow.
And so it was sort of like, am I going to deny her reality in this moment or am I going to kind of disclose that yes, what she is seeing in in a moment was real. And so he chose the latter and it saved the treatment.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's like, yeah, I think in everyday work, these are pretty rare most of the time. And again, I'm not going to name. There's some articles that I think their arguments are so sloppy and their disclosures seem really not well thought through. So most of the time, I think, no, don't do that. Um,
Is this you being judgmental? Did I miss something?
oh, no, no, no. Sorry,
Okay, so
sorry.
it's like,
So,
what are
yeah.
you? You're giving us a bad name. This is what I mean. People being therapists or self-depriving masochists. This is you being judgmental. I think somebody was
Well,
sloppy.
yeah.
I thought you were
Well,
going to stand up from your chair and fireworks were going to go off, bright red,
well, thank you, because I
Yeah,
feel that one of the therapists who I won't name
right.
has gotten very mad at me about my criticisms that I've already placed on
Wow.
Substack. So I'm sure he would say that I'm being very judgmental. But yes, I'm trying to. So this may be part of why I'm trying to measure
I
myself.
see. So let me ask you this. What's this? No. It's Voldemort. What is in contemporary times, that is the year 2026 that it is right now, are things like Davies and Gabbard's very neat conversation and psychoanalytic dialogues happening at all? Or is it now so spicy, like everything else in the moral landscape being so polemical and vitriolic and these false binaries and camps and tribes? Can you even have the discussions? And given that you're writing this paper, been researching this for so long.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now I'm going to get judgmental about another thing
Okay,
because
please. Yeah.
here's what I think.
We haven't left the judgment.
We have left the judgment zone. Here's part of what I think the issue is. And this
Okay.
is me. I'm not an analyst. I'm a psychoanalytic therapist. Like I was trained psychodynamically, but I'm not inside these like inner circles. And in writing this article and submitting it to certain journals as an outsider who's not, I don't, who's not like following certain mentors or teachers, like maybe who doesn't, I'm not in the community in the same way as like people who are reading my articles and reviewing them, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the issue with the psychoanalytic community in America, and I'll just speak to America, is that we're siloed. So it's like, I think part of what's happening is specifically the relational community, which I think is the largest psychoanalytic community in America. I think they need to talk to like Lacanians, they need to talk to the intersubjectivists, need to talk to the contemporary non-relational analysts. Like everyone needs to talk more to each other because there is such great stuff from each perspective. And I think what I've been seeing as an outsider is people get siloed in their little communities. And it's like, this is sort of like, this is the way we have found the best way to practice. And then, yeah, articles are published from people in these camps. And it's like, okay, so this is what we think about this. And this is what we think about this. And there's just not a lot of like diversity of thought. And I think that has really done a disservice to, yeah, debate and dialogue where we can really think about, well, there's like another way to look at this. So that I just feel like it's never healthy, right? I mean, look at our
No.
political landscape. Like when people get siloed and start to think like this is the one right way, it's very bad. And I think, and I say this coming from a place of someone who really loves relational psychoanalysis, but I think that it's two people and it's mutual and we're disclosing all the time with our nonverbal, so we might as well just disclose it verbally. It's gone too far and there hasn't been a correction.
So before I respond, in your perspective, perception, understanding, there hasn't been any movement, the pendulum swinging back or anything like that.
Not enough.
Not enough. So my experience, right, is having one foot in the circle in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, whatever, having a more traditional analytic training. It's still the same. I've said this on other episodes. I've said this, whatever version of publicly, I have, is that, yeah, it's hard not to agree that it is like pathogenically siloed because the philosophies are so atrophied by the nature of them not being challenged. And even though being an acolyte of a New York program, a New York City program, which is this still living in the halcyon days in some ways, and then other ways acknowledges that it's not 1956, it's 2026, it's still happening. And to echo your sentiment that it's still siloed. I attended many conferences, or relatively speaking, many And it's a lot of, yes, lowercase n, narcissistic. This is the way to do it, and this is wrong. And here's your five. I remember one class I did even take was a sort of a chronological sort of Freudian to ego psychology to self psychology to intersubjective or maybe interrelational to intersubjective, as if it's evolved.
Oh, right,
And
right.
this was taught by a more sort of modern conflict theorist type of person. And many of us in my experiences at different institutions were like, ¿por qué no los dos? Like, we could have it all. Like, why can't we have, but what do you mean? It's who's still fighting? And you've heard me say this 5 million times. Why can't it be interpersonal pathogenesis as much as intrapsychic, as much as intrafamilial, as much as cultural? The idea that somebody has a monopoly, their theory has a monopoly on the genesis of suffering or health is like so antithetical to what Freud and many others instantiated and many philosophers before Freud were discovering about the human condition. It's really untenable to me. And we're not as fun because we're agreeing, which we discussed already today. It is more fun when you find somebody who's, kind of, again, really drunk the Kool-Aid or whatever it is. But it's very challenging because we're left in these positions of what's going to happen, in the analytic circles in the United States, and how do you teach people if they don't get in, which is to say they don't have access to it, which is really to say the costs and the list. We've had these, I feel like I have these conversations 500 times a year with students and therapists and even patients interested in it alike, or patients who are therapists, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting to hear your perspective, who is more of an insider. That I
Yeah,
mean, that's
I'm
fascinating.
an insider. I was at Taylor's wedding. People don't know that, but I guess now,
Yes.
I'll reveal. I was invited to MSG, and it was a fun time. It was pretty
And
cool. Yeah.
Travis Kelsey is a psychoanalyst on the side. People don't
Yeah,
know that.
Travis Kelsey doesn't know this, but he's a Lacanian. And so the problem is he's very opinionated on a lot of things. It's in terms of the desired and desired object. Speaking of so this is a predominantly male, you're speaking in the research, male to female. So we didn't get a chance yet to speak to gender or sex playing a role, because in the case of one of the papers, it's a female psychoanalyst or woman. And then in other times, most of the time it's the stereotype is the middle-aged male, as far as I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So here's another talk about being siloed. And okay. So the research is clear that as far as sexual boundary violations, it's mostly male
Hmm.
who commit them.
Are you middle-aged or elderly?
I feel elderly,
Okay.
but I'm technically middle aged.
No, you're technologically elderly is the really.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm technologically very elderly, as
Yeah.
you know from
Yeah.
our beginning today.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the thing. So like one feedback I've gotten is that my paper is being gender essentialist because I'm focusing on one dyad, the male therapist and the female patient.
Wait, you got to slow down for us, us Luddites and us ignoramuses. What is gender essentialist?
Well, it's sort of like I'm talking within the gender binary, which okay, so there's a point though that my retort to that is that let's use our imaginations. Yes, I'm talking about male therapists and female patients so that we can discuss specific dynamics. But of course, you can flip this on its head. Can a female therapist disclose in a harmful way to a male patient? Of course. Can a transgender analyst do harm to a cishet patient? Of course. Like can a cishet therapist do harm to a transgender patient by disclosing? Like you can flip it all on its head. Any gender and sex dyad, any identity, but there are certain power dynamics at play in this one dyad that again, you can see where it could happen in any dyad. But I think that takes using your mind.
What is that?
To see that, yes, and that's where, I don't know anything about Lacan. I don't even know if I'm saying his name right, but I feel like the whole thing of well,
It's pronounced Lacan.
Lacan, Lacan. It's like who really has the phallus, and you can see it's like in any dyad, if there's a power structure, so the therapist has power, which, I think some people would like to say it doesn't exist. And that's part of my argument is like, but we do. And so we have to own that. Or
Wow.
we could do something like this therapist in transference in the afternoon
Mm.
and sort of delude ourselves and say, well, now we're just having an affair,
Right.
which is like a total abnegation of her power, right? Like he's not your patient now, but he was for years. And so to say, like, well, now we've ended that and we're just having an affair. Yeah, I think in a way that's like she had power and she abused it. And so do men have a certain power in our society that make male therapists need to be even more careful? I would argue yes, but the therapist, by being a therapist, whatever gender or sex identity, has a level of power that I think also, yeah, isn't always reflected on in the literature on this topic the way that it should be.
Right. So in other words, my understanding of what you're saying and my understanding of the culture, that we're steeping in right now, there are all of these very sharp moral takes or implications or even explicit moral takes that say, this is the way you talk about it and this is the way you don't talk about it.
Right.
And in doing so, this has been my experience also, where the philosophy of mind stuff, the science of subjectivity stuff, where consciousness comes from stuff, and all these very, very interesting parallels to psychodynamic psychotherapy or just psychotherapy at large kind of get co-opted, hijacked, polluted, diluted because of our collective, consensual and non-consensual fears about saying something wrong, doing something wrong, saying something we think is right, not saying something we think is right. Which is all to say, there are differences between men and women, physiologically and physically. There's differences in terms of how cultural differences in terms of how they're treated. There's differences, in the transgender community or any community in that sense. I'm trying not to trip over my words here. And I guess what I'm saying is that, right, you can have a role of authority or have the phallus or anything that matter that makes, what's the best phrase I've heard, that it's a asymmetrical
Yeah.
relationship is a good
Yeah.
word, and that it's two psychologies in the room, yet still asymmetrical, that they are not
Mhm.
mutually exclusive. And in my limited education, my hands are in the air, I'm not dying on this hill. That has been the most accurate phrase I've been exposed to, regardless of sex or gender, that's a reality. But I
Yes.
agree with you that it's not agreed upon out there in the big world, psychoanalytic world, psychotherapeutic world, helping professions world, what have you, it's you can't even have those conversations sometimes, but it seems very true given these predispositions of men and women, or any gender again, playing a role. And if you can't tolerate the multivariate, influence or causality that enters into the room, I agree that it feels unethical itself to deny how complicated and complex these things actually are. So if you're saying that it's not a two-person psychology, which there's still people, if you're saying that it's not asymmetrical, but it's mutually authoritative, if you're saying that, expertise is a bad word or a good word, I don't even know. But this is part of why it's sort of floundering in that sense, where there's no agreement, no consensus, no venue for us to have these discussions.
Yeah, right. Sort of like if we don't have a shared common understanding,
Right. Where
then
do you even
it's hard.
start? Yeah, where do you
Where do
even
you
start?
Yeah. Which, let's shout out to Lou Aaron. He
Right.
wrote, so clearly on that topic. It's mutual but asymmetrical. He, so clearly, he's one of the founders of the relational movement. So there's a way to not I keep throwing the relationalists under the bus, but they've forgotten their, founding fathers and mothers in a way.
Well, how
Because that
perfectly psychoanalytic is that?
Yeah, yeah, which I guess is the whole history.
Right. If they're stuck in rebellion and they've never individuated, and these narcissistic injuries can be resolved by the punishing of the father and, or stealing of the mother. And it's very, very challenging because this stuff's happening, like you said. That's the thing maybe we should end on, is like, it's happening.
Yeah,
This article just came out a few months or whatever, 5 months ago, whatever it was, you know,
transference in the
yeah,
afternoon.
yeah. And the, Glenn Gabbard and Davies debate was 25 years ago, which is a long time, but also not a long time in the scheme of human psychological development. And as all of us as therapists of whatever ilk, whatever our team is, we all experience, ought we be tolerant and humbled or humiliated enough in our training, the vastness of the human condition, where we have patients say and think and feel anything. And it's our job to hold that frame so that they can say, think, and feel anything without us violating that, in service of being able to reflect upon it, in a space that's conducive to that, without it being acted upon in an impinging or harmful way. And it's like, how did that become so controversial?
Yeah. That's a great place to end it, because that's like,
Stop. You're too good to me. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
You humble me by this sort of first dive in back to the seat. I look forward to having you on again. I can't thank you enough.
Thanks, friend. Okay, that was fun.
Bye.